Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie. I have a return guest. I have Michaela Wade. She's co-founder of the Family Law Assistance, and she was last on my podcast, Season 2, Episode 116, and Season 3, Episode 175. The last time she was on, we talked about will the court see through the lies and why we should work together. And today we thought we would discuss issues regarding the Hague Conference. So I welcome you back to Slam the Gavel. Michaela, how are you doing?
I am cold.
Yes.
Hence the sweater dress. Like I said before, I'm not leaving anything to chance. We've just had snow where we are. So that's just coming down thick and fast. And
Oh, wow.
But always warm in your company, Marianne.
Oh, thank you. Same here. Same here. Now, with this Hague Conference, there's a lot of confusion with people. Some people understand it, but there are some glitches to it. And what have you run into with some of your cases?
So first of all, just to back up a little bit, I took a bit of one of my favorite things to specialize in actually is international child abduction. And I think that's mainly because I grew up as an expat. I was that expat girl. I actually grew up in the Middle East. I started school education actually in an American schooling system. And believe it or not, I remember when I came back to the UK, I had the strongest American accent ever. And my mother put me into elocution lessons, and hence what you've kind of got today in my accent. But I realized that the world is quite a small place, and it doesn't matter where you are in the globe, the principles still apply. Humans are humans, people are doing things internationally. So I have a real hankering for international child abduction. And part of the challenges that I see this side of the pond for sure is where a parent abducts a child to a non-Hague Convention country.
Mm-hmm.
That can be really, really difficult to orchestrate internationally, and the agencies internationally to have that child returned. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes, honestly, I think that's probably why I like it, because one of the courts we've got, so we have the Royal Courts of Justice. It looks like Hogwarts. It's one of the courts you see often on the television. But that particular court will have something called tit staff, and tit staff are kind of like the High Court police, and they have the power and the authority to issue port alerts in ferries, across airports, all a bit James Bond like. They can seize passports. I have had that happen. I've had High Court police raiding parents' homes at 2 a.m. and seizing their passports. So, it's quite draconian stuff. And one of the things that, I mean, it's difficult when agencies, I mean, we've only got to think about our own governments. Yeah, Department A doesn't speak to Department B. We just think about the family courts in the beginning. And it's like most things that are government run, they tend to be a bit slow and a bit clunky, but very often that's their only lifeline. So you're right. I think, when you're dealing with that, that's locally. There's inconsistencies, there's clunkiness, there's Department A not speaking to Department B in our own country, in our own locale. You magnify that times the globe, and naturally there are going to be inconsistencies. There are going to be agencies that don't play ball. And that's where people who've signed up to the Hague Convention, there are lots of countries out there that haven't signed up to the Hague Convention. I recently had a case where the child was being abducted to China, non-Hague Convention. And let me tell you, that was horrendous to return the child back to the United Kingdom. So, yeah, you're absolutely right, Marianne. There are inconsistencies. There are, for want of a better term, there are cock-ups. And here's the thing, right? I am never really a fan of conspiracy theories, because I think if there was such a thing as a conspiracy theory, that would infer that at least somebody's got a plan, at least somebody knows what's going on. But the reality is quite often nobody's got a plan, and it's more often cock up than conspiracy. So I totally, you are preaching to the choir when I say, yeah, I totally acknowledge there are inconsistencies, there are cock ups, and there are gaping holes where, and not just the piece of legislation itself, very often if you're taking that Hague conference and what goes on, that in its own looks quite sensible. It's a bit like the laws you have. If you look at it on its own, actually, that's quite a decent piece of legislation. It's the interpretation of it that gets watered down. I mean, hey, that's why we got courts, right? It's the interpretation of it. It's the orchestrating usually of it, especially when we're talking about things like international child abduction, especially when we're talking about when we sign up to the conventions such as the Hague. And then there are other ones, but obviously we're just talking about the Hague. It's also the most well known as well. Most popular countries have set up. And then, you know, you've got their own people in their local jurisdiction. I had a child that was abducted to Spain. That's like literally a hop, skip and jump from here in the UK. But getting the child back from a remote part of Spain, yes, it was signed up to the Hague Convention. Yes, the government agencies played ball, but Spain is quite a big country, you know, there's quite a lot of mountains there. So to actually locate the child and locate the parent who'd abducted the child took some serious negotiating and time. One of the greatest enemies I think we have at all in family courts, whether it's national or international, is time. Time often is our biggest currency when we're talking about these matters. And it's not necessarily our time, because what constitutes an emergency in our time doesn't always translate to what constitutes an emergency for the courts or for the governments, or heck, even the international governments. So that time lapse is something that people can usually ill afford, especially when a child gets abducted. I mean, sort of like the missing persons, like the longer it goes on, the harder it is to orchestrate and get that child back. So yeah, huge inconsistencies, and it's the bane of my life, but also the most exciting part of what I do. Ironically.
You know, have you ever ran across a situation where a parent maybe should abduct a kid to the other country? You know, I mean,
here's the thing. I think when we're talking about, so, you know, let's be real, abduction, where we're here, certainly it's illegal. So unless you've got the agreement of everybody that holds what we call parental responsibility for a child, then it's illegal. Or you have the permission from the court, it's illegal. It's also illegal to retain a child in a foreign country without the consent of people, of all holders with parental responsibility, or without the permission of the court. So first of all, it's illegal, and that's why, you know, you have international child abduction, and that's why there are laws there, and that's why things like the Hague Convention exists. I think there's a difference between having a child abducted to a different country and or returning a child to a country perhaps of origin. So I had a case once where the mother of the child wanted to relocate herself and the children to Norway, but she was Norwegian. She had a family support network in Norway. She had a job in Norway. She grew up in Norway. So it on the face of it, it would seem that actually that seems quite a natural thing for, you know, afford a child the opportunity to grow up and show them and experience part of their heritage. The child was dual heritage. Actually, in the end, her application got turned down because it turned out that it was shown that she was alienating the children against the father. So her motives for relocating for her back to Norway was had malicious intent behind it. So yeah, I think there's so many facets to this. The courts will look at all sorts of, and I say this not just in the UK, but the principles that I've seen internationally. I mean, you know, I travel for work. I mean, I was in Dubai, Morocco, and I was in Holland. I mean, I traveled quite extensively last year. And it doesn't matter where I am in the globe, those principles still exist. You know, when people are looking to relocate to a different country / different continent.
Mhm.
Of course, you know, questions like motives, what plans has that parent got, what relationship has a child got with not just the person relocating but the non-relocating parent, and
Mhm.
then how to fight that in court. And I think that's increasingly more difficult when the country in question is not part of the Hague Convention. So, for example, earlier on in the year, I had somebody who wanted to relocate to Dubai. Hey, I grew up in the Middle East, so this was kind of my bag, right?
Yeah.
But even so, no matter how sort of civilized and no matter how, you know, corporate and very much into this world, Dubai and the United Arab Emirates are, it's still not part of the Hague Convention.
Mhm.
So if facilitating the contact between father and child, if it was to go wrong, that's a lot of trust. It's a lot of trust to put on one parent, because
Mhm.
effectively the court's saying, do you trust this parent enough to be able to promote the relationship between child and the non-relocating parent? Now,
Mhm.
you and I both know by the time people go to court, trust is like gone. It's non-existent.
Mhm.
Communication goes. Trust and communication, usually one of the first things that go out the water. So if you're relocating to a non-Hague Convention country, for everybody in question, that's a massive gamble.
It is. You know, like you said, you got like checkpoints. If someone were to try to leave the country, we have that too, but sometimes people get through those somehow.
Right. Yeah. And the timing's that's important. I was talking about the timing, you know, so when we put out port alerts, when you've got the ferries, the airport checks, and a bit Bond like, you know, as the people are coming through and you've got, you know, the flashing and noting people of interest, that you're right, that does rely on a timing thing as well, because how quick is it? And, you know, how quick can that port alert get out? How far ahead is that parent planning? Have they already slipped through the border? You're right, it's very, very tricky.
Now, there are two countries that do not acknowledge the Hague, which I think one is Japan, the other one, um, I want to say Israel, but I know I'm wrong. I can't think of the other one.
Yeah, I can't think of the other one either, but there's
Lebanon. I think it's
you. All right, okay. So
maybe.
there's a few that not only don't acknowledge it. I mean, you've raised two, but I can think of others that
Mhm.
aren't part of the Hague Convention. And
Mm.
yeah, but you're right. Depending on where you are in the world, like some of them, I know they have to go through a rigorous process to be part of the Hague Convention in the beginning.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to sort of sit here and judge as to what extent they are or they're not, but I do think that different countries are going to have very different attitudes, and not just the governments themselves, but locally as well. I mean, you might have, like, you raised Japan. Japan, on the face of it, actually is very pro Hague Convention on the face of it, but in reality isn't. They
Mhm.
don't play ball, and in fact, the way that they often deal with disputes is it's very much about who you know, and / or let's not also forget, money talks and people mumble. And in some of these countries, you
Mhm.
know, it's not, you know, they're not afforded the sort of access to material and justice that perhaps is afforded here in the UK and perhaps in the US.
Mhm.
You know, I know that, for example, Italy, it is very much about who you know. I just think of an example. And I mean, I always say, no matter what my fees are, the average cost of a solicitor's is like a good twice of what I charge.
Mhm.
That's a national average. But there are some countries where the national average would be 4 or 5 times the rate that I charge. And that means that access to justice in any form is reserved only for the elite,
Mhm.
is reserved only for people who can genuinely afford it. I mean, here there's a wide range of solicitors who have ranging costs, but in some countries that's just simply not the case. So, and you might need that legal help because there might be a language barrier.
Right.
There might be certain different procedures, different forms to fill in. I know, for example, in India, some of their forms are very, well, they're very wordy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they will use 10 words when really, honestly, 2 would do. So it's very, it's overly eloquent. I actually, because I'm such a nerd like that, I actually understand why they do that. That actually comes from quite a lot of old English, a lot of old English. But if you were to read some of like Indian documents, which are translated into English, it becomes, the language is extremely flowery. It's littered with
Mm-hmm.
Latin maxims, whereas, you know, I don't know what it's like in the US, but certainly here in the UK, they've tried to make contracts and legal words less jargony, you know, but not all of that's the case. Some of it's very, very different. And the procedure and the court setup is very different in some of these countries.
So if a parent wants to get their child back using the Hague, so they've got to hire attorneys over in that country as well.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And I suppose that there's pros and cons to it. So being part of the Hague Convention means, in theory, that government agencies are supposed to liaise with each other. They're supposed to set portals. They're supposed to communicate, but that's still difficult. And again, the timing. And then if your child is abducted over there, you may very well have to expedite the matter by engaging somebody that's in their country. I had somebody that was actually taken to Australia, and it was so costly that my guy said, you know, I fortunately didn't come to it. The matter got resolved beforehand, but you know, he was there thinking, I'm just literally going to fly you over to Australia because A, you know my case, and B, it's just going to be a lot easier and cheaper to fly me to Australia,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
24-hour flight to sort that stuff out. So yeah, and that's an English speaking country, you know.
Right. Right. You know, how long were you there? I'm sure you were pulled into a courtroom and all this began.
Yes.
No.
So funnily enough, actually, I dealt with his case when it was in London, at the Royal Courts of Justice. So I dealt with the international matter. And weirdly, so his child was taken to China, not part of the Hague Convention. So that was an issue.
Mm.
But she got leave to remove, and then moved on to Australia. He's actually Australian himself. So yeah, so by the time the child visited him in Australia, the child didn't want to be returned back to China. So she was claiming that he'd abducted the child, and he's like, well, no, she doesn't want to go. So it's never black and white. It's always shades of grey. So she was making an application in Australia to get the child returned, and he was like, well, I need to be making an application to keep the child in Australia. He's Australian, he's got Australian family. And at one point it got so bad that he said, you know what, I'm just going to fly you out to Australia just to help sort this out because you're a heck of a lot cheaper. The flight alone would be cheaper than hiring a lawyer over there. So it's definitely something for people to consider.
Yeah. Oh, I can't imagine. And even finding a solicitor that is adept in this Hague convention and the ins and outs of that.
Right, right. So, I mean, I had a case recently, and just to give you an idea of cost here, the case I was talking about, the case to United Arab Emirates, not part of the Hague Convention. So we had to get what's called a mirror order. And lots of people, by the way, who are relocating to different countries often need that, something called a mirror order. But of course, depending on what country you're in, the judges in that country may not be aware of the laws and the procedure in the other country.
Mm.
So how likely is it that a mirror order can be made? Now, whether your child is abducted or whether, again, within the Hague Convention, whether that you're relocating to a different country, it's usually advisable to have something called a mirror order so that you, if you need to, you can, without too much headache, enforce that order in the country they're moving to, as well as enforce it back in. So you kind of got that same order in both countries. Mm-hmm. You've got each country then to sort of belts and braces it. But to give you an idea, she had to employ a lawyer in the United Arab Emirates that for a letter and a consultation, because obviously they need a consultation, and to report back to the court, to educate the court, you were looking at a 3-figure sum.
Oh, no.
Ridiculous. Yeah, ridiculous. Yeah. So I think when we're talking about either it's child abduction or whether people are relocating to any country that's in that Hague Convention, it's costly. It can be costly. It can be slow and frustrating. And you also think about, never mind the emotional and mental toll that it takes on a parent. They don't know. I mean, when your child is taken away on the other side of the globe, trust me, that feeling of, oh, it's a small world after all, doesn't feel small. They do feel like they're at the ends of the earth. You know, very often parents don't have a plan. Very often it's not always well thought through. They've not sought the appropriate channels. They've not gone through court and asked the court's permission to go. They've not sought, perhaps in some instances, they've not sought the permission of anybody with parental responsibility to go in the beginning. They've just decided, I don't know, I fancy doing a yoga retreat in Bali, we're going. And that's kind of been it. So I've seen all sorts. I've dealt with all kinds of countries. I've dealt with Hague Convention countries and non-Hague Convention countries. And in my experience, typically the execution of it doesn't overly matter where you are in the globe. I mean, I had a case, for example, where a child was looking to be taken to Brazil. Well, I'm not sure whether you knew this, but I mean, Brazil has got massive high abduction rates. So, you know, the safety of that, the medical system in Brazil for expats, not great. Not great. So, you know, I think it's very multi-dimensional when we're talking about this. So as it happened, the prep work, and oh, by the way, I say this, it doesn't matter what case we're dealing with, the magic is always in the prep. And I always say, well, you know, well, Hollywood's got a lot to answer for, you know, because if I was to do a documentary or something about what actually goes on in family court, it would be really boring, and me sitting around in a consult room for hours drinking terrible coffee.
Right.
Definitely, it's not an episode of Suits for sure. But I think that mental and physical, emotional toil on parents is absolutely massive. And I think when we're talking about enforcing any of this, it can be really, really difficult. And very often I sort of advocate my guys to do a lot of their own sleuthing. You know, there's lots that one can find on the internet, thankfully, because I remember a day when the internet, which makes me sound like a dinosaur, I know, but no. I remember days when like the internet wasn't quite so up and at 'em like it is today. But you can find out quite a bit. I mean, thanks to the virtue of social media. Like, I mean, one child was found because she had a TikTok account and posted something on TikTok, and they managed to locate where the child and the parent had gone to just from the surroundings of TikTok. Amazing. It's amazing.
You know, so these parents have it, I guess, in their minds that they feel they should have the child and just go to another country.
Yeah, sometimes.
And what I've heard of, you know, Japan is that the courts treat it like it's a family matter. If you go to try to get the kid back, they don't care what the previous court ordered, whether it be the UK or the United States. The judges just brush it off as if it's a family matter, and that parent's out of luck. They're not going to get their kid back. It's whoever abducts the kid first.
Right. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and that's absolutely true. And by the way, Japan isn't the only country that does that. I know quite a lot of countries that act like that. Yeah, in a word, yeah. Like I said, and that is a perfect example of how if you don't have a mirror order, and who goes around asking mirror orders, especially in the beginning when there's a flurry of activity, especially in the beginning where a parent may not know that their child has been taken abroad. Maybe they've just found out off the internet that they're going, or maybe it's just a flippant comment that their child made, that made alarm bells ring. So it's not always a thought through plan. And let's not also forget that that parent who's just received that news is often in shock, and that shock prevents, it's like the rabbit caught in headlights. They're a bit paralyzed. They don't quite know where to go. They don't quite know where to go for advice or for help. So, that whilst they're still getting to terms with what's going on and working out where to go, where to get that advice, well, that's fine, but you've already created that distance. So the first thing, people don't think of, oh my gosh, my child has been abducted. Do you know what I need? I need a mirror order. Said nobody ever. So, but without having that mirror order, you're absolutely right. You find very often that, and in fact, that case in Australia, that didn't have a mirror order. And we were dealing with the family courts, despite the fact that actually it's international child abduction, despite the fact that it's illegal, but despite the fact that there are laws, not just everywhere, about international child abduction. Child abduction is illegal. And yet, you're absolutely right. The number of times that I end up seeing so many parents end up in the family courts, and what they end up doing, and that's again, that snowballs into the cost as well, because you're not dealing with the police necessarily. What you'll find is that Department A doesn't speak to Department B, and you end up in a family court trying to fight the family court with a solicitor who doesn't speak. It becomes a roller coaster and a domino effect as well. So I do absolutely feel, I think my biggest tip, I guess, always was be vigilant. In reality, I always say that nobody knows your ex quite like you do. And trust your gut. I get lots of people, and I have to say I fight the flip side of this as well. I have people that say, oh, they're going to be internationally abducting my child. No, they're not. They're just going to Spain for a holiday. It's a 2-week all-inclusive vacation. Get over yourself, okay? But that sort of paranoia. But deep down, people will know. And when I speak to clients, I can tell. I've been doing this for such a long time. I can tell whether or not, no, they really are fearful that their child is going to go. And it's often something external. It's something that is not just within themselves, thinking, oh my gosh, well, they've got family in Iraq, I think they're going to go back to Iraq. It's often more than that. It's often something they've seen online, because people post the most bizarre stuff online. People can't keep this from Stum. They post away on social media. So the gift of social media, that is, or it's something that the child has said inadvertently, either inadvertently or on purpose. Like sometimes they've come out, oh, mummy or daddy is selling the house, and I've gone to see my new school in America, or whatever it is. So there's often something else that alarm bells start ringing. So I'll always say, be hyper vigilant about that. The trick is to stop it from happening in the beginning. So wherever you are in the UK, if you've got that, I would rather make the application look a pillock in front of a judge, but at least the child's not gone anywhere. Because the minute they do, that's when the problems, I think, really start. That's when you have to rely on international government agencies talking together, and that doesn't always work, and it's expensive.
When parents have this gut feeling, I won't keep you too long, but when they have this gut feeling and they're saying, their ex is saying, your home is in this other country and grandma and grandpa are waiting for you, and this is your home, and say your mother or father doesn't really love you anymore anyway, so we're going to go there. And so they come to you and say you go before a judge. Does this judge, take this seriously?
They do. So I will always be devil's advocate. If I'm assisting those parents, or that parent who wants to go back and the home and granny's waiting for you, and this is where you're from, this is your roots, I am always the sanity check. I will ask those awkward questions, because if I'm not, a judge will. So I'll usually do a deep dive, find out what's the real reason of going. What was contact like beforehand? Do they have a history of not keeping contact arrangements? Is this parent that's going to frustrate contact? How have they thought about how contact is going to happen? In a very famous case, a social worker quite eloquently put it, you can't hug Skype. I'll tell you, give you an idea about how long ago that case was. But, just by have they got that plan? What schools are they going to? Where are they going to live? What about the support network? How are they going to facilitate contact with the other parent? Who's going to pay for that? How often is that going to happen? What contact arrangements were already there? Because if a child has already got a kind of shared parenting agreement already, is that detriment? Are they going to severely lose that detriment just because they're going to sail off into the sunset? So there's so many box ticking exercises. I'll always say, depending on who you are, if you're the applicant and you're the relocating parent, it helps if you've got siblings, it helps if you've got a plan. I cannot emphasize that enough. Okay. It helps if you've promoted the contact with the other parent. If you're the non-relocating parent, it helps if you've got a shared arrangement, because you've got time on your side. Time is the biggest currency in family court. Time with the children, time in the family court, having that status quo. The status quo, no matter where you are in the universe, the status quo is the most difficult thing to overturn. So if you have a shared care arrangement, how is that going to work? How receptive are they to having that work? How committed are parents? Because you think about how difficult it is to maintain arrangements when parents are separated in the same country. Imagine what it's like when you've got parents on the opposite side of the globe. Who's going to facilitate that? And it doesn't always work. I had a case where one party was in New Zealand, and there was a whole ferrying system put in place to take the then very young children from door to door, including chaperone services and nanny services and chaperoning services on the plane to get from A to B. So there's a lot more orchestrating that goes on in facilitating contact internationally.
And these parents that feel they can just take the child away from the other parent, have you found anything wrong with their psychological evaluations?
It depends, actually. So one of the things so funny enough, the case that I had in Australia, the mother that was relocating had perpetrated domestic abuse against the father. And now this case was quite a while ago, I admit, but I tell you this, had it been the other way around, had it been him that was perpetrating domestic abuse against her, it would have been a totally different outcome. But I mean, part of the exhibits, for example, when I don't mean sort of putting a trigger warning right now, was that she'd bitten a chunk out of his back and had stabbed him. I mean, it was quite horrific. And yet, with all of that, the judge wasn't particularly interested, which I found at the time pretty horrifying when you think of the level of abuse. So, I mean, it's interesting. I do a whole sort of, I do a lot of TikToks myself. And one of the things I talk about quite a lot is actually mental health issues. And they often go undiagnosed. So do I think that there are parents out there that have unilaterally taken the decision to remove a child that have mental problems? I'm not sure is the honest answer to that. Unless it gets diagnosed, I can't make that diagnosis. I can't sit there and judge. I mean, it's very fashionable as well these days, I think, to label somebody. So like, it's very fashionable to label someone as a narcissist, and I'm always very, very careful when people are contacting me and they say, well, my ex is a narcissist. And I'm like, are they? Because there's a difference between being a diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder and, let's be real, they're just being an idiot. They're not just, they're a deeply pleasant person, which is often that happens, especially when people separate. So, I'm very cautious not to be the one that says, God, that's a really nuts thing to do. I mean, it's completely unprofessional of me anyway. So I think the key thing here is to have it diagnosed. And by the way, if people genuinely have mental health, there's often a trail. It's often starting, it doesn't come out of a vacuum. So if people and parents do have mental health issues, they often have a history of it, and it might have been starting out as anxiety and depression. It may go through to something else. And I have a case at the moment where the parent has had a long history of mental health issues. It started with anxiety and depression and ended up with psychosis. So you know, there's always a trail of people who have mental disorders.
Now, going back to my first question, when I said, do you think that, some parents think it's, that they're going and it's okay, but have you found that their friends or relatives are chirping in their ear to leave, and it's okay to leave?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Especially the primary carers. So primary carers often tends to be mum. That's just the nature of it. Everyone's got an opinion, right? Friends, family, and the internet. Let's not also forget the internet, okay? Because there's so many groups out there that people put what they reckon. What you want to do is ... I wouldn't put up with that, as everyone's got an opinion. And especially, so I always, fun fact, I often kick family members out of my consult room, because whilst they're there and they've got a vested interest, because either they're their grandchildren or they're their best mates or whatever it might be, that is not helping my clients. So and they'll chirp in their ear. What do you want to do with this? I would be doing this. I spoke to my Aunt Gerald's second cousin twice removed, and he suggested you do this. That doesn't help.
No.
That doesn't help. They're not the courts. Yes, there always is a posse of people around them that will have an opinion. And I don't limit that actually to just friends and family, because birds of a feather flock together. And I find that they'll probably join internet forums, and that whole confirmation bias, they're going to tell, they're not there for, it's interesting. I've removed myself from a whole load of groups online, because I very often feel that the parents who go on there, they're not actually not usually seeking advice. What they're seeking is validation. And I don't think, or they're very angry. They're not. They just want to whinge. They don't actually want to resolve the matter. So yeah, people's heads are turned by friends and family who think it's okay, and they almost have that confirmation bias of that one-man upmanship. I mean, I remember having one case, and it was a mum actually, who decided to unilaterally, she did want to start a yoga retreat. I think it was in Bali, something like that. But it was just weird. Her plans fell apart because actually she had this kind of, well, I'm mum. And you sort of hear the cadence of amen behind that, and she genuinely believed that, but had no plan. Actually, her application probably would have been successful had she had a plan, had she thought of. But the fact that she had this one-man upmanship, actually, that was her Achilles heel, because that prevented her from thinking clearly. She just felt that she had this sort of God-given right, which was enforced by her friends and family and the land of the internet.
Right. Oh, well, I'm glad we talked. And I'd like to have you back on again. I'm sure we'll come up with another topic. So I'll put your contact information in the podcast notes from the last time you were on. But don't jump off. Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these family courtrooms. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again here in the future with Michaela Wade and other exciting guests. I totally thank you so much for your expertise, Michaela. Thank you.
You're welcome.